مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. تشير الإحصائيات إلى الكسد قوية، فوفقا لمراكز السيطرة على الأمراض، وحتى منتصف شهر يناير تم تلقيح 63% من الأشخاص المؤهلين للحصول على اللقاح في أميركا بالكامل. هذا يعني أنهم تلقوا جرعتين من لقاح فايزر أو لقاح موديرنا أو جرعة واحدة من اللقاح الآخر. هذه نسبة أقل من 30. من بين هؤلاء حصل أقل من 40% منهم على جرعة إضافية أو معززة. هذا يعني أن هناك أكثر من 200 مليون أمريكي لم يستخدموا ما يقدمه العلم للحماية من فيروس كوفيد. لماذا يشكك الكثير من الأمريكيين بهذا التقدم الصيدلي الباهر؟ ما هو وجه المقارنة مع رفض الأمريكيين للابتكارات الطبية الأخرى التي تنقذ الأرواح؟ هل يجب على الحكومة إجبار الناس على أخذ اللقاحات في الوقت الذي أصبحت فيه مشكلة صحية تمثل أكثر تحدي نواجهه في السياسة العامة؟ فإن السؤال الرئيسي هو متى تتجاوز الصحة العامة الحريات الفردية؟ لمناقشة هذه القضية يسعدني أن أرحب بخبيرين يتمتعان بمعرفة وخبرة فيما يتعلق بمكافحة فيروس كوفيد، وهما الدكتور بوب أرنوت والدكتور تايسون بيل. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Vaccines, therapies, and their skeptics. Hospital wards across America are full of people these days, the vast majority of whom are unvaccinated. Why? Well, names that weren't in our vocabulary just 2 years ago are now commonplace. Mmoderna, Pfizer. Let's look at the numbers. About how many Americans eligible for vaccinations have received their 2 doses of these vaccines?
Well, the official vaccination rate now is 63% across the country. Up here where I am in Vermont, it's in the high 80s. Down in some of the rural red states, it's like to be in the 40s or so. So it's highly varied. Unfortunately, the booster rate is a good deal lower, maybe 40 or so percent of those who actually have been boosted and would be protected against Omicron because just being vaccinated isn't enough.
Where you are, Dr. Bell, how are the numbers looking?
Yeah, so our state is about 65% of those who are eligible are fully vaccinated, and that's more or less in line with the national numbers.
And of these Americans who've had what are called fully vaccinated, a term which has taken on some controversy these days, about how many have received their booster dose?
Yeah, I think the fully boosted population is down more towards 40% or less. And of course, in different parts of the country, it's even less than that. The key was, of course, that if you were immune compromised and you had 2 doses, you might have no antibodies at all. So you need to have that 3rd dose. But now we know that with Omicron, the 2 doses of the original vaccine just aren't enough to mount an antibody response to Omicron, which is why you see breakthroughs with people who are just vaccinated as opposed to boosted. And they will change the terminology where fully vaccinated is going to be boosted as well.
Yeah, it's very confusing. And I think the terminology is going to be changing. So one thing we should just say outright, giving a booster shot, so a 3rd dose, is really what people should be aiming for once they're eligible. We found that the Omicron variant has had the ability to evade initial immune response. And while you remain protected very well from getting severe illness, symptomatic disease does tend to pick up after about that 6-month mark. Now, the CDC has used the term fully or updated with your vaccinations, which would mean that you've got your 2 doses, your Pfizer or Moderna, and you have a 3rd dose they consider that updated vaccines. And I think at some point down the road, the definition of fully vaccinated will actually change to include people who have received a third dose. So eventually, I think it'll be a requirement to have a boosted shot.
That means it's only a minority of Americans that have their full complement of shots. Why?
So I think the protocols will be updated for booster vaccines. Absolutely. We update every year for the flu. This changes. They call this RNA virus the king of errors. Every 2 weeks, it makes a mutation. So if you have the virus in a very sick South African patient for 6 months, it's going to mutate and mutate and mutate. The beauty of this mRNA vaccine, which is the technology that's used in Pfizer, Modiерna, is you can simply update. So I expect to see many more as time goes on.
Dr. Bell, let me ask you just point blank. The science is clear on this, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, all you have to do is go into any ICU and ask the staff there what kind of patients they're seeing. The face of the pandemic has changed once vaccinations are rolled out. In my institution, the University of Virginia, around 75% of our patients with symptomatic COVID are unvaccinated patients, which is remarkable because the majority of our own population is vaccinated. So there's a disparity when it comes to folks who are unvaccinated overrepresenting the people in the ICU. And so you ask the question, well, if you have 75% of people in the ICU who are unvaccinated, who are the other 25%? Those who are fully vaccinated, maybe boosted. These are people who are severely immunocompromised. So I'm not talking about people who may be on a little bit of steroid or medicines like that. These are people who have had organ transplants, liver transplants, heart transplants, people who've had stem cell transplants. They're taking medicines that severely suppress their immune system. And many of them actually have not been boosted as well. So they may be fully vaccinated and not boosted. So when we're talking about the people in their 40s and 50s who may have a couple of chronic medical conditions, take a couple of medications, I am not seeing those people if they're fully vaccinated. It's really the folks who are unvaccinated and those who are at severe risk of immunocompromise who we're seeing.
So the anti-vaxxer movement has been enough to make you want to pull your hair out. I mean, it's so much misinformation and bad science. And it has led to as many as 148,000 excess deaths since June or so. So, it's a terrible scourge right now. But the anti-vaxxers, like all propagandists, will take an element of truth. And there is an element of truth. That is, you could be fully boosted. In fact, one of my closest relatives, her whole family was boosted and they all got Omicron, but all they had was a sniffle. None of them got sick, none in the emergency room. So it's true. You could have a breakthrough infection, but it's highly unlikely that you'll end up hospitalized in the ICU or die if you've been fully boosted, unless you're older or you have real defects in your immune system, which means you've had organ transplants, as an example, or have some very, very powerful chemotherapies.
In your view, is there an organized anti-vaccination movement? How did that take off?
So the anti-vaxxers worldwide have found the number one platform. If an individual wanted to be heard on social media, heard in the regular media, and develop a big, big following, they become an anti-vaxxer. So even in South Africa, as an example, you have a lot of anti-vaxxers and a very low vaccination rate, and especially among whites in South Africa. In Germany, you have red states that are so red, they're actually called crimson states. Bobby Kennedy Jr., who I know very well, he's raised over $6 million for his anti-vaxxer platform. So people have simply found a platform. It is a message that resonates. And unfortunately, it is filled with lies and fraud and duplicity. And I'll probably get myself in trouble here, but if somebody has not been vaccinated, I would say, look at, one, you're terribly selfish because you may end up killing other people, relatives, friends, strangers, and you lack a basic sort of bravery and camaraderie. You kind of dig in, get the vaccine because we are all in this together. And for people who would say, what about mandates? I would say, well, look, at practically speaking, they work. United Airlines said you have to get mandated. Most of their pilots and crews got vaccinated. Healthcare systems, it worked. People mandated it, it worked. In Europe now, we're increasing, you can't lead a public life. You can't go to a movie theater, or a cafe, or restaurant without being vaccinated. It's having a real effect. And what I would say is, you have to put it in the realm of driving. You have to wear a safety belt. You're supposed to have airbags. You're not supposed to speed. You're not supposed to cross over a double line. You're not supposed to drag and drive. It's the same public health measure. And I would very much liken the anti-vaccinated to drunk driving. It became too political on the right with Trump, and it became too political, frankly, with Biden. You know, if we'd gone through your family doctor and pushed it otherwise, I think it might have been more successful. So mandates scare people, but they work.
We've spoken about the individual implications of not having your full vaccinations, but Dr. Bell, tell me about the public health implications, the community implications. If someone wants to roll the dice on their own fate, that's one thing, but here these decisions have wider implications, don't they?
Well, certainly very important, because this is not a virus that you keep to yourself, right? The nature of it is to spread to others. And so when we talk about personal freedoms, which is often an argument that anti-vaxxers use, what we're missing from that is the fact that your decisions could lead to the death of somebody else, either someone in your household or someone you love, or even someone that you may not know. So many of my patients who I've admitted to the intensive care unit were infected by someone who was not vaccinated. And so we have to have this larger conversation about what are our values as a society. Do we actually want to protect people? Do we want to keep our neighbors safe, our community safe? The majority of us would say yes. But what that means in this instance is that we really need to require vaccination, and we really need to overcome the hesitancy, the misinformation and disinformation, and make it clear that the vaccines are the way to protect yourself in this pandemic.
When we come back after the break, we're going to take this discussion of the immediate impact of the anti-vax movement and broaden it up to a national public policy discussion. What, if anything, the U.S. government should do, either to incentivize or penalize people in order to change their behavior to get vaccinated, in just a moment. From the earliest days of our republic, indeed, even before there was a republic, African Americans played a central role in the history of our country. Starting with enslaved people brought here against their will, to Crispus Attucks, the first man killed in the pursuit of freedom for the colonists, to such historic figures as Harriet Tubman, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Condoleezza Rice, and Colin Powell. Black men and women have built America and made it a better, stronger, more inclusive country. In the world of sports, we remember Jackie Robinson, the first to smash the color barrier in our national pastime, baseball. In the world of Hollywood, we remember the Bahamian-born actor Sidney Poitier, a tall, handsome man of remarkable grace and presence, who was the first Black person to win an Academy Award for his leading man role in the 1963 film Lilies of the Field, playing a handyman helping a group of German-speaking nuns build a chapel. He then went on to win every honor an actor could receive, including a knighthood from the Queen and the Kennedy Center honors here in Washington. Sidney Poitier died this month at the age of 94. May he rest in peace. My recommendation, any movie he made. Again, my guests today include Dr. Tyson Bell. Dr. Bell is Assistant Professor of Medicine at the University of Virginia in the Divisions of Infectious Diseases and International Health and Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine. He's also Director of the Medical Intensive Care Unit, where he has been treating COVID patients since the onset of the pandemic. Also joining us is Dr. Bob Arnott. Dr. Arnott is former chief correspondent at NBC News, where he helped to explain medical issues to millions of people in America and around the world on a daily basis. He's also a best-selling author and award-winning war correspondent with extensive experience covering the Middle East. So let me just ask generally, have either of you had experience in the past of there being a public health emergency that so many Americans were disregarding the advice of the local, federal, and state authorities as much as is happening in this public health emergency? Dr. Bob?
Well, so the interesting thing is that public health is the biggest failure in medicine. You know, it's failed forever. I mean, sure, look at the obesity epidemic. Everybody's ignored the government on that. Look at alcoholism. Look at drug abuse. You know, the programs are largely ineffective, and there are enormous failures across, you know, all spectrums of society. So public health just hasn't worked. I think a part of it is, you know, there isn't the precision of medicine. What bothers me is that with this pandemic, we have tremendous precision with these vaccines, great precisions with these new drugs by Pfizer and Merck, great precision in terms of, you know, all the procedures and IQs, but no precision when it comes to public health. It's taken 2 years to get to the point that we have high filtration in 95 masks. We still haven't addressed indoor air. So, you know, we actually had an anti-vaxxer movement here in Still, Vermont, that came through here. And we as parents ganged up against them because the same movement had been to Minnesota, and they had taken this Somali refugee population and told them, don't get vaccinated for measles. They had roughly 52 cases and some very, very sick kids. So it's a real and terrible and vexing public health threat.
Dr. Bell, what's your view on the issue of government mandates to require citizens to have vaccinations?
We have to use every tool and toolbox that we have to encourage, require, and mandate vaccination. And the key is we can't just rely on just one strategy. So the federal government, the Biden administration, announced a plan through OSHA to require large employers to require their workers to be vaccinated or have a weekly test. And that was struck down by the Supreme Court. So we don't want to just rely on that, but we want to make it so that if someone who is unvaccinated can freely make that choice, but it comes at the expense of not participating in society.
We only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to ask both of you, if you could sit down with the president and offer your unvarnished advice at this point of the pandemic, what would you tell him?
So actually, during the transition, I did send him a deck, and I did tell him exactly what I would do. And I said, look, you have got the whole pharmaceutical vaccine part of this figured out. You need to focus on basic prevention, and you're not. And that means, first and foremost, viral-free indoor spaces. And that includes airliners. Airliners have hidden behind the guise of these great ventilation systems, and they're good, but they're not powerful enough or run hard enough to be able to rid the cabins of viruses. And it's also why Omicron came from South Africa to dominate worldwide in weeks. People didn't drive or take the boat from South Africa. They went by airplanes, and airliners are great vectors. So I would tell the president, you really should have vaccinated crews and passengers, have high filtration masks, and test before somebody gets on an airliner, because they are great and unrecognized vectors for the disease.
Dr. Bell?
I'll tell them to take advantage of the full power of the President of the United States, require vaccination and boosting for domestic travel by any means. Lean on businesses. If the Supreme Court's going to strike down the employer requirement through OSHA, lean on businesses to require full vaccination for their patrons and employees. Do whatever you can to require full vaccination as a way to really move behind, put this in the rearview mirror, so to speak.
Urging everybody to get these high-quality masks, wear them whenever they can. I want to thank you both, Dr. Tyson Bell, Dr. Bob Arnott, for helping explain this very complicated and urgent situation to our viewers around the Middle East. Please stay well, and thank you very much for everything you're doing to help keep Americans safe. In the early 1800s, a myth began to take hold in northern England about a man named Ned Ludd. The year is 1779, and as the story goes, Ludd was an apprentice in a workshop who allegedly smashed 2 early pieces of industrial machinery, stocking frames. People like Ludd feared that manufacturers would use machines to get around standard labor practices, and that the time spent learning the skills of their craft would go to waste, as machines would replace them. Ludd was a fiction. He didn't exist. But a movement emerged around the myth that culminated in a region-wide rebellion. Mill and factory owners took to shooting protesters, and eventually the movement was suppressed with legal and military force. Over time, the word Luddite entered our vocabulary to refer to anyone opposed to industrialization, automation, computerization, or new technologies in general. Today, in the COVID era, the most common form of Luddites are anti-vaxxers. Now, most of them will disagree with the characterization. They will say they are just waiting for more research to substantiate claims that vaccines are safe and effective. Some will suggest other drugs may work. Some will suggest there are more natural ways to gain immunity from the virus. And some prefer simply to roll the dice with their lives, the lives of their loved ones, and the lives of the community around them. People who oppose vaccinations have first cousins, people who flout masks. These people are not new. When many cities and towns enacted mask ordinances to deal with the Spanish flu after World War I, millions of Americans were openly defiant. But by the time vaccinations became a norm in the 1950s, the vast majority of Americans were in awe of science and believed our scientists. Parents of 600,000 children volunteered to have their kids be human test tubes for the polio vaccine. And even after it was rolled out and there was a terrible accident with tens of thousands of kids being injected mistakenly with live polio, leading to thousands of deaths, it wasn't long before parents were back lining up to have their kids get jabbed. Anti-vaccination sentiment really took off in our country in more recent years as part of the national sentiment to question authority. Now, I believe in questioning authority. It's healthy, both for our democracy and our society. But there are limits. My plumber and my doctor are both experts, but I don't mistake their expertise or question their knowledge. There are subjective things on which I can have a different view, but there are objective things. Do I use a hammer or a screwdriver? Should I have a CAT scan or an X-ray? On which I defer to the specialist. It only makes sense. I wouldn't care so much about anti-vaxxers if it were only themselves whose lives they are risking. But it's not. It's all of us, not least by the disproportionate share of hospital beds they eventually take up when they get ill. In my view, we should incentivize vaccinations as much as possible, and if necessary, implement tough measures to name, shame, and isolate the offenders. People can have a different view on how to win over the anti-vaxxers. Let's just get it done. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول النقاش الوطني المتعلق باللقاحات والصحة العامة والحرية الشخصية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ إنسايد واشنطن أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.